Welcome to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, sponsored by MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com and Barntime Productions at barntimemusic.com, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to healthy dialogue around all things local policy in the North County San Diego area. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing density to elections. So today we have the privilege of bringing in Matt Gunderson. Matt is a candidate for state senate in California's 38th district. Matt's originally from Wisconsin, but a little over 20 years ago he moved to Orange County and started an auto dealership, Infiniti of Mission Viejo. He also built two additional dealerships from scratch, Audi of Mission Viejo and Volvo Cars Mission Viejo. Gunderson was also appointed to the Audi National Dealer Advisory Board and the Infiniti Dealer Council, where he served as council chairman for 3 years. So as I just said, Matt's running for District 38. District 38, which was formerly District 36, governed by, represented by Pat Bates since 2014. But we have the new, after redistricting in December, now we're looking at a district that spans roughly from San Onofre in the north or so to Mission Beach in the south and covers some new territory, including Del Mar, La Jolla, and Pacific Beach. So he declared for office towards the end of last year. Is that right, Matt?
Yes.
And he's running against Catherine Blakspear, who's the mayor of Encinitas and the current chair of SANDAG. So I want to get right into the issues. So first, one question when I reached out to people in my circle, sort of, and I said, what questions should we bring up to Matt? The number one thing was local control, density, housing, zoning regulations. People want to know where you stand, and I get a sense from our last interview where you expressed opposition to bills such as SB 9 and 10 and made some other comments that you're very much on the side of maintaining local control over housing law, density law, et cetera. And in Encinitas specifically, and we're recording Encinitas today, there's been a considerable amount of controversy over some of the large-scale R30 housing element update projects, such as the Goodson Project, the Clark Project, Maria Village, et cetera, that people feel do not fit the infrastructure needs of our communities. And this isn't just Encinitas, this is a statewide issue. So from your perspective, Matt, I'm curious to know how, I know you oppose SB 9 and 10, but how can we, or how can you specifically as a potential legislator advocate for greater local control at the state level? Like, what are some policy solutions that you would get behind to advance self-determination for municipalities like Encinitas?
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate that first question because that certainly is a driving force here. But before we go there, I just want to clarify the district issue. You're right. This is 78% of the current 36, redistricted, renumbered to 38. It starts down at Mission Beach, runs up all of coastal San Diego County, up through Camp Pendleton, and then it also includes a significant portion of inland Orange County. So we go as far north as Rancho Santa Margarita and Coto de Caza area in Orange County, and then all the way down to Mission Beach and the 8 freeway. Inland, we grab Rancho Santa Fe, Vista, a little bit of Fallbrook. We even grab Fashion Valley and USD. So it's a convoluted drawing of the cards, but we go significantly past San Onofre. So I just wanted to clarify that for any of your listeners who might think they are not or are in the district.
Sure.
Every vote counts, and I encourage everybody to vote. So with that said, back to local control. SB 9 and SB 10, I believe there's going to be an effort in every legislative session from this point forward to try and repeal them. The Sacramento's whole concept of having, excuse me, a one-size-fits-all approach to local control isn't a good option. I mean, we know that Vermont is not the same as California. Excuse me. And if Vermont is not the same as California, we also have to acknowledge that San Jose is not the same as Cardiff by the Sea. And when the Sacramento pushes these mandates down into local municipalities, well, any acknowledgement of what the infrastructure needs are, what the public safety needs are, it just doesn't work. And, let alone the character of your communities. And I think we've got to get back to an idea and a concept of, the best decisions are made the closest to home. So I would say to the state legislature, look, everybody's in favor of affordable housing and solving the problem of the cost of living in California and the cost of housing in California. But with that said, every municipality is different. So let's take the incentives that the state might put in place, pass them down into the individual municipalities, and then let Encinitas decide what they want to do with the incentives in place. And how does it best address the needs in Encinitas? One size fits all just doesn't work.
Sure. So do you feel like, because the state has imposed certain mandated housing numbers on not just Encinitas, but cities across the state, and to meet these numbers, sort of the perception is that some of these numbers aren't really realistic for municipalities because of the existing infrastructure. Like here in Encinitas, I keep coming back to it, but a lot of the infrastructure, according to people that I talk to, hasn't been updated in decades. And so do you feel like the affordable housing numbers pushed by the state on local jurisdictions are realistic? And if not, then what to you is sort of that correct balance then of still pushing for affordable housing requirements, but respecting that local autonomy?
You know, I mean, the numbers definitely aren't realistic, and they're gerrymandered, much like redistricting is on the political side. The idea that Coronado is going to add a number of units, I think their number is in the low thousands on a Coronado, it just doesn't make any sense. How are you going to do it? And, you know, again, it's all about local decision making, and the people in Encinitas have to have the authority and the power locally to make the decisions that are best for their community. I'm a businessman and not a politician. This is my first run for office. So I can't tell you that I know exactly what bill I'm going to introduce in Sacramento on day one to say, hey, this is how we solve the issue of affordable housing. But I know that philosophically, deep down, my underpinnings are all about local control and about local decision making, and that one size doesn't fit all. And the idea that they can play political games with the distribution of RHNA numbers to these different communities and have smaller communities like Coronado or other communities in northern San Diego County try to accommodate a number or an allocated requirement that might work in a densely populated city like downtown San Diego or someplace like San Jose isn't realistic. Like, come on, let's think about preserving the character, preserving the communities that we have, and at the same time respecting the infrastructure and public safety needs that exist. Markets will play out as well at some point, and communities will figure out locally what's best for them in terms of providing housing that is more affordable.
Sure. So I don't think it's controversial to say that there is an affordable housing crisis in California. And what, in your opinion, is sort of driving that? And how would you tackle that as a state legislator?
Well, I think it isn't just affordable housing that's a problem. It's the cost of living in California across the board.
Right.
You know, we are overtaxed. We are overregulated. Excuse me. And at some point, we have to acknowledge the fact that we're driving middle-class California out of the state because they can't afford to live here. And it isn't just the cost of housing, it's the cost of everything.
Yeah.
And you can start right there with the gas tax. I mean, for gosh sakes, Newsom even supported the idea of grandfathering and taking a pause in the gas tax, and the progressive Democrats in Sacramento wouldn't do anything about it. And, you know, they're in a mission to get you out of your car and get you onto your bike or into your walking shoes. And, you know, that's not a sustainable approach in the short term. I mean, we have got to figure out how to be responsive to people's needs, the average family's needs, and their ability to put food on the table, pay for their kids' activities, and, you know, provide a middle-class lifestyle here in California. We're rapidly becoming a state that only serves the wealthy and the poor, and that's not sustainable.
Sure. In our last interview, you made the comment that, and I believe this is a direct quote, that California is no longer the Golden State. And it is true that California did recently lose a congressional seat actually due to population decline. It's consistently also, according to the numbers I look at, in the top 4 expensive states to live in the country. So sort of how do we tackle these underlying factors? Like, what do we do to make California a place that's not just sort of separated into rich and poor and driving middle-class families away into other states?
Well, I think, let's start by just, again, addressing the fact that we are overtaxed and overregulated. And I have called for a middle-class tax cut where anyone who makes under $50,000 a year or families that make under $100,000 a year would pay 0 state income tax. Okay? That's only a $19 billion hit to the state budget. And we spend money like fools in Sacramento with no accountability, no transparency, and I'm certain that we can find $19 billion of waste up there to give some tax relief to middle-class Californians. In addition to that, we have a $98 billion surplus right now. So an immediate tax cut for middle-class California would be beneficial. Now, for some people in California and many of the people living along this beautiful coastline in San Diego District 38, that amount might be a rounding error for them. But for a lot of people, $700 to $1,500 a year makes a big difference in how they can provide for their family.
Sure. Do you do you feel like when you talk about overregulation, are there any specific regulations that as a legislator, you would personally vote to repeal or push back against a little more?
Well, actually, I've told you already that I'm a businessman and not a politician. And my 23 years of business experience and employing people in California gives me a little bit of a different perspective of how we can address things that help individual families. California wage and hour law simply benefits trial attorneys and opens up a Pandora's box of opportunities for them to harass small businesses with wage and hour violations that in the end only help the trial attorneys. I'll share an example with you. We had a young single mother of 3 kids working for us, and she wanted to come to work at 8 and work until 2, and then take her lunch break at 2 o'clock and go pick up her kids at school, take them to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and then come back and finish out her shift. Well, when a trial attorney figures out that we're doing that, he knows that that's technically a an hour violation in the state of California because you're not allowed to work more than 4 hours and 59 minutes before you clock out for your lunch break. I mean, it's a ridiculous regulation that makes no sense and drives up the cost of living and changes the ability for employees to adjust their life and their work schedules to such that work for families. I mean, that's just one example of regulation that's onerous and not realistic, and it doesn't serve our working people. In addition, they just passed that labor board for fast food restaurants, okay? 12-person board that is going to be appointed by the governor, the head of the Senate, and the head of the state assembly. And that board is going to set working standards and wage levels for fast food restaurants. Well, it sounds good. First of all, in theory, perhaps to some people, but I have a problem that it's specifically pointing out or isolating one small segment of the restaurant industry. But in addition to that, I mean, McDonald's and Taco Bell are large enough, and they have the infrastructure and such where they can just automate. So those jobs are going to disappear. You're going to order your Big Mac from a kiosk. You're not going to have a conversation with somebody for a part-time job for a high school kid. Okay, but the small mom and pop Mexican restaurant or Greek restaurant in your neighborhood, what choice are they going to have? The choice they're going to have to accommodate these ridiculous standards set by a labor board in Sacramento is to charge you $24 for your burrito. What's that doing? Driving up the cost of living in California for everybody. It's not a solution. Sacramento right now just says we need more government. There's a government program that can solve everything. And that's the problem with the one-party rule in California. There's nobody being able to push back and have that check and balance.
Sure. We talked about affordable housing. I want to move to a related issue. That is of homelessness in California. Now, I do know a lot of your views already from our last interview, but I mean, you've said that in our last interview that you don't believe that the state's investment, billions and billions of dollars in a housing first approach has been successful when it comes to homelessness. So what's the correct approach? And can you explain to people, I mean, I already know from talking to you, but can you explain to people some of those specific proposals that you have in mind?
Well, I housing first isn't the solution, because it's not compassionate to let people continue to live in squalor on the street or move onto a rooftop and continue to live in squalor and abuse themselves. I mean, 85% of our homeless population is impacted by either mental illness or addiction issues. So for us not to believe that we have to invest some significant resources in treatment is just wrong. I mean, we're not going to solve the problem. We've spent $20 billion in the last 4 years in the state of California to address homelessness, and what do we have? More homeless. I mean, that's not a solution. And, building rooftops is not the only answer. We need to bring these people off the streets. We need to do an extensive assessment of what their needs are, and then we have to hold them accountable and get them into treatment. I mean, current law does not allow a charity to take state funds if they want to hold these homeless customers of theirs that they're trying to help to any level of behavior that would include drug testing. I mean, what's the solution? I mean, we're not going to put money here just so you can continue to use drugs, abuse your body, and then impact your community. We've got to be serious about treatment.
Sure. So one of the things we talked about in that earlier interview was the ACT proposal, and that was a few months back, but ACT stands for Accountability, Compassion, and Treatment. And I believe that was something that was being pushed for at the state legislature, but it was sort of stalled at the time. So can you sort of explain to people what this proposal is and why you support it?
Well, that was a $19 billion investment proposed by the Republicans in the state Senate to address the homelessness issue with accountability, compassion, and treatment. And it would be an infrastructure, kickstart to the mental health and behavioral health programs on the county level. Their proposal was that it would come out of the $98 billion surplus. And yeah, it got stalled because it was a Republican idea. And right now, Sacramento isn't a bipartisan place. It was a Republican idea, and the Democrats won't hear of it. And, that's unfortunate. That's part of our overall problem in Sacramento. But, I mean, that ACT program that the Republicans proposed addressed the issue of treatment, addressed the issue of compassion and giving them shelter, but also addressed the issue of holding the homeless people accountable for their behavior and putting them on a progress and on a direction and a trail towards a solution of becoming mainstream productive citizens.
Sure. I want to talk also is related to homelessness is, the issue of crime in our state. And that's something that you've been very adamant about is sort of you can't tackle one without tackling the other. And California's violent crime rate has definitely gone up. It's gone up by, according to the Public Policy Institute, by 6% in 2021. And in the past, in my conversations with you, you've sort of blamed state laws such as Prop 47, Prop 57 for sort of exacerbating public safety issues. But I'm just curious, other than just repealing some of those laws, what is your approach on this issue? What is it? More enforcement? What's kind of your approach to public safety?
Well, first of all, we have to respect and empower our law enforcement officials and our public safety officials to be able to enforce the law, and when they do, support them. This whole idea of defunding the police and reimagining public safety, I mean, you see what we've got. I mean, that movement hit the dirt, and people had great enthusiasm for it in a short window, and now you see what we have. You're scared to go to the downtown Encinitas because there's somebody who might be, committing a crime right at your local coffee shop. I mean, it's smash and grab robberies, it's carjackings, you name it. I mean, up and down this district, I mean, the rampant crime is immense, and it's not necessarily violent crime, but it's crime that is a nuisance to your community. And so you got to start by making, reducing that level of $900 as to be the threshold for something becoming a felony and being jailed.
That's Prop 47, or is that?
That's Prop 47. Yeah. You've got to put people, and Prop 57 as well. I mean, they both need to be removed from, we were sold a bill of goods as to how effective they would be, and they were sold to the general public as being neighborhood, school, and safety acts. I mean, that's just not the reality. I mean, but again, I would say from the very beginning, we have to get back to a perspective that our law enforcement officials are to be respected, they're to be supported, and they're to be empowered. And you're going to have to allow them to also deal with the homeless at the same time. And, I've often said to people, I said, you're going to take some, barbs from the ACLU on this, because the homeless you don't get to just live on the street because you want to. I mean, that might seem like a logical ACLU position to take, but it's not okay when it starts to negatively affect your community.
Sure. And just Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, but Prop 57, since we didn't really explain it, for people unfamiliar, has to do with prisoners being released early due to overcrowding issues for good behavior credits and that sort of thing. While Prop 47, as you said, is tied to, misdemeanor versus
Prop 57,
felony.
I mean, early release, I mean, if we don't have an infrastructure system where on early release that gives them a support system to become functional in society again, sure. Early release is just a recipe for disaster.
Sure. That's a good point. Now, it's interesting, on one of the last podcasts we had, with Assembly District 77 candidate Dan Downey, he was very emphatic that he felt as though you can't talk about crime and public safety in this state without talking about the issue of border security. And specifically, he argued that you have all these potent opioids and narcotics that are flowing sort of unchecked, as he described it, into our big cities. That's sort of fueling our substance abuse problems, fueling crime at sort of these lower quality of life levels. So I'm curious to know, do you kind of share that perspective, or what's your approach, if any, on the border security issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fentanyl crisis is real, and it's every day, and we are losing a jumbo jetliner number of passengers a day to fentanyl overdose in this country. And if we had one airline crash per day, we'd stop flying, okay? And our government, and this is mostly on the federal level, but our government is doing nothing. I mean, we have a border issue in this country. We don't necessarily have a border issue in our state because people don't want to talk about it, but California, for the most part, has a wall. Okay, we don't see this influx of immigrants and the drug cartel using our border like they're using Arizona and Texas. And it has to stop, but that's largely a federal issue. On the state level, our legislature would not even criminalize possession of fentanyl. The existing state legislature, controlled by the progressive Democrats, would not even, in this last session, criminalize the possession of fentanyl from a misdemeanor to a felony. I mean, where's their head? Where is their passion and their purpose and their focus on addressing the issue and keeping our young people safe in California? I mean, there's just not a good reason for it. There's no good explanation for them to not do that. And, so I share Dan's position. Like, the border security is incredibly important. It's a human rights issue, and it's a public safety issue.
Sure. Any final thoughts on crime? I wanted to shift topics a little bit, if that's okay with you. Yeah. So earlier this year, with SANDAG, there was an audit of credit card purchases by staff, which showed questionable and potentially improper spending of taxpayer money, with hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on special retreats at bars, restaurants, et cetera. And then later on in the year, as of October, the Coast News, our own newspaper, came out with a story about there being $290 million in questionable contracts between SANDAG and its vendors. Now, the first part of a two-part contracts audit report was released a few days ago by the Office of the Independent Performance Auditor, and it raised questions over the agency's handling of hundreds of millions of dollars in on-call and sole source contracts. So SANDAG has sort of been under the gun lately. It's been beset by scrutiny. And I'm just curious to know if you have any thoughts on the ways in which this organization has conducted itself through this process and sort of what needs to change.
Well, I think the most troubling thing about all of this SANDAG business in terms of the scandals is just the fact that, the chairman of SANDAG, Catherine Blakspear, who's my opponent, won't take responsibility for any of it. She's not asking for accountability from any of her staff, and she's not transparent about it. I mean, she won't have a conversation with anybody. Early on, we challenged her to debates, we challenged her to public forums, and she's unwilling to participate. And it's because these kinds of questions would get asked, and she doesn't want to have to answer them. Let's start with the $200,000 plus amount of dollars in credit card abuse, okay? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? What have they changed to make sure that doesn't happen again? Prior to that, there was inoperable toll booths where they lost over $1.8 million worth of revenue because nobody was paying attention to whether or not the toll booths were working. Then, this latest audit, $293 million of overextended contracts and gross over budget spending. And we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse in government spending, and clearly there's waste at SANDAG, and that people are abusing the system at SANDAG. And when it comes to fraud, we don't know about that yet because they won't announce or release the names of the contract holders and these vendors until after the election. They want to talk about that in January. Well, how many of them are supporting elected officials who sit on that SANDAG board, like Catherine Blakspear or Todd Gloria in San Diego? I mean, they've got to be held accountable, they've got to be transparent, and they've got to answer to the constituents because they're spending money like drunken sailors, and the reality is it's not their money to spend, it's the taxpayers' money. And it's unfortunate because I don't know that, the chairman of SANDAG is Catherine Blakspear, but the executive director, Hassan Urquhart, just donated thousands of dollars to her campaign. Who's protecting who? Catherine Blakspear told the San Diego Union Tribune that SANDAG needs to reestablish its trust with her. Well, who's establishing trust with who, Catherine? Because you are SANDAG. You are chairman of the SANDAG board. That organization answers to you. So who's supposed to establish trust with who? Because she certainly has, destroyed her trust with the constituents in North San Diego County, who she supposedly represents on SANDAG's board.
Sure. Do you feel like, are you sort of suggesting that, you mentioned the donation from the executive director to Catherine and sort of the fact that they're delaying the full transparency about the audit until after the election. So do you feel as though there's sort of a improper political relationship between SANDAG and some of the candidates such as Blakspear?
Well, there's that old saying that perception is reality, and certainly the perception is there that there could be real conflicts of interest. And, when you're in a public office, you need to be very careful to stay, to avoid any conflicts of interest like that. And I think it's just convenient for them to get all the audit done, but no, we're not going to tell you who the vendors are until January. The timing seems a little strange to me. I'm a businessman, not a politician. If one of my department managers came up to me and said, I'm 700% over budget on this project, I'd be asking a lot of questions, and I don't think that person would have his job very long because you can't afford to do that. And I'm not talking about 700% of a small project. We're talking millions and hundreds of millions of dollars.
Sure. Do you, sort of we've talked about the scandals, but with Blakspear specifically as your electoral opponent, sort of for the average voter, like why should they sort of care about how she's conducted herself as the chair of SANDAG and sort of linking that to the scandals that it's been beset with?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's all about integrity, transparency, and candor. And she hasn't displayed any of that in terms of how she has operated as chair of SANDAG. If you are chairman of a board and there is questionable dealings inside your organization, you better take responsibility, be accountable, and ask the questions. It doesn't appear like anybody's really asking the questions. It just begs the question of who's protecting who. And at the end of the day, as a public servant, you should be protecting the taxpayers and the interests of the taxpayers. And it doesn't seem like she's doing that.
Sure, fair enough. As for SANDAG itself, aside from the controversies, I mean, when it comes to transit, I mean, SANDAG, last year voted in favor of the regional transportation plan, $164 billion in investments into infrastructure, transit infrastructure for San Diego. And this is not going to happen for decades, even if if taxpayers approve it. But what's your thoughts on transit with SANDAG's priorities on transit? Like, do you think they're headed in the right direction? And as a state legislator, like, sort of what would your priorities be when it comes to reforming transit in California?
Well, I think, mass transit is always something that we can look forward to, and we can look down the road, and we should try to encourage to make it efficient and productive and useful. But in San Diego County, this $164 billion transportation plan that they have in place or have planned, in its rosiest scenario, according to Hassan Erkata himself, will serve 11% of the San Diego County population. That's like the bullet train to nowhere in terms of spending, in terms of what you benefit from it. The cost benefit is just not there. And we cannot this is much like the 2035 idea of getting out of the combustible engines in California. Should that be a long-term goal to get us somewhere? Perhaps, but you can't do it on an unrealistic timetable, and you can't do it on the shoulders of California's middle class. I mean, that transportation plan had not just a 4 cents per mile mileage use tax, but it had 4 additional taxes on top of that to fund a program that's going to serve 11% of San Diego County residents. I mean, who's going to pay all those taxes in the 4 cents a mile mileage use tax? Middle-class California that can't afford to be here already. I mean, imagine the family that, on Saturday wants to have their kid playing soccer in Chula Vista and their daughter's playing volleyball up in South Orange County. I mean, you throw all that, those additional taxes on top of to the gas tax that we already pay and the highest mileage or highest vehicle registration fees that we pay in this state. It just all circles back to the cost of living in California, and we're driving middle-class California out. I mean, we need to invest in, support, protect, and, again, just invest in our infrastructure that we have. Our roads and our highways are incredibly important. I mean, do we need to keep mass transit in the conversation? Absolutely. But we cannot ignore the challenges we have in terms of maintaining our transportation system as it is. I mean, I think there's a number of programs that have been promised for northern San Diego County by SANDAG in terms of roadways and highways and intersections that have been ignored and that have supposedly are going to be funded and done, but have not been in the interest of a mass transit plan that's going to serve 11% of San Diego County. That's just not a realistic approach.
Sure. I mean, kind of what I'm hearing from you in part is SANDAG's plan seems to sort of be trying to push people out of their cars and into public transit. And it's sort of this, idea of more clean energy, sustainable future. But sort of what I'm hearing from you is that for a lot of like middle class people, like getting out of their cars, it's just not going to happen. It's an unrealistic perception. I mean, what is sort of your perception of like the future of transit, not just in San Diego County, but in California, and how should we respond accordingly?
Well, I think that we can have lofty goals and lofty pursuits, but they have to be encumbered with a realistic timetable. And, I was in a meeting with people from Ford Corporate about a month ago, right when the Governor Newsom's plan to ban combustible engines was going on. And they said, look, we can't even make those cars that quickly. I mean, the manufacturing process in America, the manufacturers of electric cars are not going to be able to produce that many cars if you did have that hit that goal. So what is that going to do? It's going to drive the price of electric cars up in California, again, on the shoulders of the middle class. So, I mean, we need to take all of those factors into play and into a conversation and say, okay, how can we begin to address a desired goal of less reliance on fossil fuels, but within a realistic timetable that does not economically harass and harangue California's middle class?
Sure. I want to shift topics again. So this is something that you're probably sick and tired of people asking about, but it is a perception or a misperception, and that is that your opponent, Catherine Blakspear, and other people, not just her, have publicly accused you of being, shall we say, soft or misleading with your stance on the abortion issue. She's publicly advertised that you are not a pro-choice candidate. You've denied this. And I just want to read you a quick quote from one of her campaign spokespersons from a recent article we did, which says that Matt Gunderson is anti-choice and he's lying to voters about his record. He's against Prop 1 and he's endorsed by the California Pro-Life Council and other radical anti-choice groups who want to outlaw abortion in California. He refuses to denounce the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and said that insurance companies should be able to deny coverage for reproductive health care. He cannot be pro-choice and hold these extreme views. How do you respond? Do you want to clear the record?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll clear the record. The extreme position on this issue is hers. She supports abortion on demand. She wants no restrictions, and she supports Prop 1, which opens a Pandora's box to late-term abortion. It's been well documented since 1994 that I have been a pro-choice Republican. I support parental notification, I oppose late-term abortion, and I oppose Prop 1 because of that issue of late-term abortion. California abortion law, as it exists today, allows for abortions up through 6 months, and beyond that, if the life and the health of the mother's a factor. I think that is solid law. And that Prop 1 is unnecessary. California is, on the basis of the Roe v. Wade decision or the Dobbs decision, California law is not going to change. Existing California law is sufficient law on the topic of abortion.
Sure.
Now, on the topic of parental notification, which she will push back at me, I'm the father of 4 daughters, okay? I do not believe that any minor woman should be expected or allowed to go through that incredibly traumatic emotional decision alone. And if people talk to me about the one-offs of the incest, the parent that they don't want to talk to, an abusive situation, then we should work towards exceptions, such as a trusted teacher, a trusted nurse, a trusted relative, aunt, neighbor, whatever. But no minor girl should be expected or allowed to go through that decision process alone.
Sure. So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but sort of like if this is the case that you're a staunchly pro-choice candidate and she's characterizing you as otherwise, sort of you think what's behind this? Do you think this is purely a political stunt on her part, or like sort of what do you think's behind this sort of strategy as picturing you as an anti-choice candidate?
My opponent has spent the entire campaign avoiding any substantive conversation about real issues that impact California and any real solutions to the problems that California faces. Instead, she has spent the whole campaign filling the mailboxes and the airwaves with mistruths and distortions of my positions. And it obviously is her political strategy, believing that a mainstream pro-choice position like mine that opposes late-term abortion and supports parental notification is distorting that helps her justify her extreme position on abortion. 70% of Americans believe that abortion should be codified as a right, but with restrictions. She is an abortion on demand candidate, and that is the extreme position.
Sure. Well, you make an interesting point. You've made it a few times throughout our conversation, which is that, she sort of shied away from public dialogue with you, as you put it, that she hasn't debated you. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it today. for this podcast. But I sort of want to get your take because, I mean, it's not just this race. I mean, in Dan's race in Assembly District 77, Dan Downey, the Republican challenger, he's running against Tasha Borna-Horvath, who's another Democratic incumbent, and she has not engaged in a debate with him. In Assembly District 76, you have Brian Manshine, the incumbent, another Democrat, who's not engaging in debate or dialogue with his opponent, Christy Bruce Lane. Yeah. And I'll be fair and note that it's not only Democrats. And to the East County, Republican Darrell Issa hasn't really engaged in any debates with his opponent. But do you feel like this sort of ties back to the point you made at the beginning about this perception of one-party rule and sort of a lack of diversity of opinion? I mean, do you see this pattern, if you believe it's a pattern of these candidates or incumbents or established candidates refusing to engage in debate with opponents? Do you see that as sort of problematic for democracy, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, it seems to me that in many cases they're kind of using the Biden approach to getting elected, by get elected from the basement and have, put your message out, but don't really engage with the voters and don't engage with your opponent. And, it's unfortunate because California's problems are not going to get solved from the far left or from the far right. California's problems are going to get solved by having a conversation in the middle and beginning a dialogue of real solutions. And, their unwillingness to have a conversation tells me one thing, and that is that they are partisan puppets that will go along with the party leadership in Sacramento and will not question. I mean, I'll question Republicans. I'm a different kind of Republican, or I wouldn't be sitting here. I'm a pro-choice Republican, and trust me, I get plenty of grief about it on the Republican, some Republican circles. But with that said, I will challenge my party, and I will challenge that party. They clearly don't want to have any challenge. They want to follow the partisan line. And California's number one issue here is that we don't have a two-party system right now, that we are controlled by a far-left progressive dictatorship in Sacramento where there's no give and take, there's no check and balance, and you see what we have for it. I mean, a state that's getting taken off the cliff by progressive left-wing interests that are not serving California's people.
Sure. I mean, do you, in your opinion, is this sort of, as you say, it's this sort of system of one-party rule, does that sort of relate down to this refusal to engage in dialogue at the local and regional level that we're seeing?
Well, I think, unfortunately, I think it does, because they don't think they have to.
Yeah.
They think that their power is so entrenched and so protected that they don't have to engage with the voters and engage with their opposition. And unfortunately, in California right now, there's some level of truth to that, because the unions and the trial attorneys put so much money into Democratic candidates' pockets that they can control the dialogue, they can control the conversation. And so they don't want to have a conversation where they might have to answer a question that they don't want to. So they avoid it. And that's a case in point in Blakspear not having any debates or any public forums. There's a litany of questions that she doesn't want to answer that I would like to ask her.
Sure.
And you don't have that opportunity.
Sure. One more thing, kind of backtracking a bit. There's the perception, or as you would say, a misperception of you on the abortion issue. But it's interesting because there's also sort of these accusations coming from Democrats and Blakspear. And also it kind of came up on our podcast episode the other day we had two political scientists on to discuss the same race. And one of them described you as a quote, squishy MAGA candidate. And there's this sort of perception of you from the left, I guess, that you're sort of secretly tied to this MAGA Republican branch of the party, that you're sort of downplaying for the time being your ties to the far right, but you're sort of doing that for electoral purposes. So I'm curious, kind of that aside, how do you accurately see yourself on the spectrum? Just, in terms of characterizing yourself as a more moderate Republican, that seems to be the impression I'm getting. But sort of how do you respond to that perception?
I would tell everybody I'm a pragmatic Republican. I'm a fiscal conservative and a social libertarian in many ways. I mean, I really believe that, the best government is the least government that's necessary. And so when I look at myself as a moderate, conservative, whatever, the idea of being squishy and MAGA, I don't really understand. I grew up in Wisconsin, back in the time when Dukakis carried Wisconsin. And I was a moderate Republican back then, and I'm still consider myself a moderate Republican today. To share some background information, I mean, I'm the seventh of 8 kids. My oldest brother, when I was in high school, ran for the U.S. Congress. He ended up becoming the first openly gay Republican congressman in the United States. And that was back in the early 90s, before it was kind of cool to be LGBTQ. And I understand those issues in terms of where parties traditionally lie and end up on them. And, for their accusation that I'm some MAGA Republican isn't based on any fact or any conversation. It's just based on their desire to, throw falsehoods out there in the interest of the campaigns. I'm as honest, candid, and transparent as the day is long. And there's going to be some people in my campaign who say, oh, you shouldn't have said this. But I'm going to tell you, did I vote for Trump? Yes, I did. But I chose policy over personality, okay? But that policy is all about economic policy, and it's not about social policy. And, I have been very adamant and very clear for years that I support LGBTQ rights. I'm a pro-choice Republican, and I am not a climate change denier. I mean, all things that would say, hey, he's a pretty moderate guy.
Mm-hmm. So you see it that there's sort of the Democrats in the 38th race are sort of trying to push you into this extreme corner that's just not consistent with the more moderate positions that you've publicly adopted.
Exactly. I mean, they don't want to have a substantive conversation about issue positions. They want to name call and throw negative ads at you because they've got all this kind of money, And unfortunately, in politics, there's no libel. They can say and write whatever they want to. And I don't think that's a good part of our political process, but it's the reality. And as I've said before, I'm a businessman and not a politician. I haven't been on the ballot in California before. And so this is, a little surprising to me about how completely lack of substance her campaign has been.
Mm-hmm. Last of all, I do want to touch on just sort of the campaign as a whole. You've been doing this now for close to a year.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, and this is your first run for any office at all, correct? So I'm curious, to know sort of how the campaign's gone for you, and specifically, we were talking about this before we started taping, but you're from Orange County. A lot of this district consists of San Diego. So sort of what's been your strategy for reaching voters who are more in San Diego, outside of your maybe comfort zone? And how are you feeling about the election overall right now?
Yeah, just to clarify, I've been on the ballot once before in the state of Wisconsin, but this is the first time in the last
California
many years that I've lived here for 23 years, and I've never been on the ballot in California before.
Yeah.
But in terms of my biggest surprise about the campaign is the fact that there's never a substantive conversation about issues. It's all about name calling and finger pointing, and the misinformation that's distributed, and it's unfortunate. But on top of that, I do live in Orange County, South Orange County, in the northern part of this district. And, that was the easy part because I spent 10 years on Mission Hospital's board. I was on the Saddleback College Foundation board. Prior to that, I was a youth sports coach. I was very active in the community and in our the public arena in Orange County, but even though I wasn't a politician. Now, coming down to San Diego County, I have to establish my credibility, earn the respect of the voters, and earn the respect of the people who are the movers and shakers in these communities. And, I was actually surprised at how quickly people were willing to have a conversation about where are you coming from and what's your perspective on government, and how intimately interested people are, not just on the local level, but on the state level and the federal level in politics here. And it's been interesting to me how there's been this incredible groundswell of support. And to some part of it is, looking for a different kind of Republican, that they look at our national landscape and our state landscape and say, you know what, I don't think the Democrats are getting the job done. but I have some issues with the Republican Party right now. And I think I'm that happy medium in the sense that I'm a moderate Republican on social issues. I'm not an election denier. I'm not a climate change denier, but I still believe in accountability, local decision making, fiscal conservatism. And, I'm really, really pleased by the fact that I could tell you very candidly that those who know Catherine Blakspear, my opponent, best are choosing Matt Gunderson. The groundswell of support out of Encinitas has been shocking to us, but has been very encouraging. I mean, we've got two groups, one out of Encinitas and one out of Carlsbad, the self-generated Democrats for Gunderson groups who came to us and said, hey, would this be helpful if we created this group? Because we believe you bring a lot more to the table and a lot more to the conversation than your opponent does. And, I have told many people along the way two things. First of all, I'll be the most candid, transparent, and accessible state senator that you've known, because that's maybe my retail background, but if I had to spend as much time talking to people who didn't like their car as I did talking to people who did like their car. And I think that's an important perspective. And on the other side, I would just tell you that I've also shared with many people that I don't know that I'm the very best person for this job, but I do know that I'm the very best person who's running for this job. My business background gives me a completely different perspective than most people in Sacramento, and definitely than my opponent, in terms of getting to Sacramento, asking the right questions, and having a dialogue across the aisle that can open the eyes, ears, and minds of the Democrats and say, hey, here are all the unintended consequences of some of the stuff that you're pushing down on average people, average small business owners, average job creators in the state of California. That's not working. And I think it's important to have a different perspective than what is sitting in Sacramento, because what's going on right now isn't working.
Sure. And I don't know if your campaign's been conducting any internal polling. I know there was a poll that Blakspear's campaign put out a while back that showed the race was relatively even. I think she had a slight lead, but I brought on a couple analysts the other day who said that, she may have a slight lead right now. It's pretty close. I'm curious to know, like, with maybe polling you've conducted, or just sort of where you see this race at right now. Like, how close is this race, and how do you feel about your chances? I
think this race is going to be really close. I think the momentum is on our side. The momentum, fortunately, is what will carry us through Tuesday. I approach this like it's a tie ball game, and now we're in we're in the ninth inning, and we have to keep our nose to the grindstone. We're cautiously optimistic. I've had others say to me, look, hey, no, it's going great. You're going to do great. I'm like, yeah, I'm a businessman. I don't count my money until it's in the bank. So we're hard at it. And I would tell you that they obviously are scared, or the state Democratic Party and their union funders wouldn't keep putting more money into Catherine Blakspear's checking account. Just last Friday, they put another $490,000 in her checking account for the last, week and a half of the primary. I mean, that's shocking to me that this state Senate race will, be a $12 million campaign between the two of us. And, it's unfortunate that money plays such a big role, but I think proof is in the pudding that they wouldn't be spending the money from Sacramento down here if they didn't think that we have a really, really solid chance of winning this.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Matt, thanks for coming on. Any final thoughts?
No, I appreciate your time, and I wish that there was more dialogue like this. And as I've said before, I'm not the most articulate issue guy, but I'm not the dumbest dog in the kennel. I've often said that the learning curve is immense when you're coming from outside the political arena. But I think instead of coming there with a whole wealth of policy experience, I come to this with a bunch of experience that is real world experience that can look at issues with a different set of eyes and a different perspective. And as I said, I'm not the dumbest dog in the kennel, and I will learn quick, and I hope to have the opportunity to serve the constituents in the 38th State Senate District and bring practical, common sense, conservative thinking to Sacramento so we can have a dialogue to solve some of California's problems, bring us together from the right and from the left and bring us together and solve some problems.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it today. And hey, we'll bring you on for another episode, hopefully.
All right.
Let's make it happen. All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsors, MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com and Barntime Productions at barntimemusic.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in and viewing the show. We'll see you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.